Hello, this is Morel Benard with the continuation of the story Wuthering Heights. And please subscribe to the channel and please share the videos. Thank you very much. Last words were that the clouded windows of hell flashed a moment towards me. The fend which usually looked out, however, was so dimmed and drowned that I did not fear to hazard another sound of derision. "Get up and be gone, out of my sight," said the mourner. I guessed he uttered those words at least, though his voice was hardly intelligible. "I beg your pardon," I replied, "but I loved Catherine too, and her brother requires attendance, which for her sake I shall supply. Now that she's dead, I see her in Hindley. Hindley has exactly her eyes. If you had not tried to gouge them out and make them black and red, and her 'Get up, wretched idiot, before I stamp you to death,'" he cried, making a movement that caused me to make one also. But then I continued, holding myself ready to flee. If poor Catherine had trusted you and assumed the ridiculous, contemptible, degrading title of Mrs. Heathcliff, she would soon have presented a similar picture. She wouldn't have borne your abominable behaviour quietly. Her detestation and disgust must have found voice. The back of the settle and Earnshaw's person interposed between me and him. So instead of endeavouring to reach me, he snatched a dinner knife from the table and flung it at my head. It struck beneath my ear and stopped the sentence I was uttering. But pulling it out, I sprang to the door and delivered another, which I hope went a little bit deeper than his missile. The last glimpse I caught of him was a furious rush on his part, checked by the embrace of his host, and both fell locked together on the hearth. In my flight through the kitchen, I bid Joseph speed to his master. I knocked over Harrington, who was hanging a litter of puppies from a chair back in the doorway, and blessed as a soul escaped from purgatory. I bounded, leaped, and flew down the steep road, then quitting its windings, shot direct across the moor, rolling over banks, then wading through marshes, precipitating myself, in fact, towards the beacon light of the Grange. And far rather would I be condemned to a perpetual dwelling in the infernal regions than even for one night abide beneath the roof of Wuthering Heights again. Isabella ceased speaking and took a drink of tea. Then she rose, and bidding me put on her bonnet and a great shawl I had bought, and turning a deaf ear to my entreaties for her to remain another hour, she stepped onto a chair, kissed Edgar's and Catherine's portrait, bestowed a similar salute on me, and descended to the carriage, accompanied by Fanny, who yelled wild with joy at recovering her mistress. She was driven away, never to revisit this neighbourhood, but a regular correspondence was established between her and my master when things were more settled. I believe her new abode was in the south, near London. There she had a son born a few months subsequent to her escape. He was christened Linton, and from the first she reported him to be an ailing, peevish creature. Mr. Heathcliff, meeting me one day in the village, inquired where she lived. I refused to tell. He remarked that it was not of any moment, only she must be aware of coming to her brother. She should not be with him, if he had to keep her himself. Though I would give no information, he discovered through some of the other servants both her place of residence and the existence of the child. Still, he didn't molest her, for which forbearance she might thank his aversion, I suppose. He often asked about the infant when he saw me, and on hearing its name, smiled grimly and observed, "They wish me to hate it too, do they?" "I don't think they wish you to know anything about it," I answered. "But I'll have it," he said, "when I want it. They may reckon on that." Fortunately, its mother died before the time arrived. Some 13 years after the decease of Catherine, when Linton was 12, or a little more. On the day succeeding Isabella's unexpected visit, I had no opportunity of speaking to my master. He shunned conversation and was fit for discussing nothing. When I could get him to listen, I saw it pleased him that his sister had left her husband, whom he abhorred with an intensity which the mildness of his nature would scarcely seem to allow. So deep and sensitive was his aversion that he refrained from going anywhere where he was likely to see or hear of Heathcliff. Grief, and that together, transformed him into a complete hermit. He threw up his office of magistrate, ceased even to attend church, avoided the village on all occasions, and spent a life of entire seclusion within the limits of his park and grounds, only varied by solitary rambles on the moors and visits to the grave of his wife, most at evening or early morning before other wanderers were abroad. But he was too good to be thoroughly unhappy long. He didn't pray for Catherine's soul to haunt him. Time brought resignation and a melancholy sweeter than common joy. He recalled her memory with ardent, tender love, and hopeful aspiring to the better world where he doubted not she was gone. And he had earthly consolation and affections also. For a few days, I said, he seemed regardless of the puny successor to the departed, that coldness melted as fast as snow in April, and ere the tiny thing could stammer a word or trotter a step, it wielded a despot sceptre in his heart. It was named Catherine, but he never called it the name in full, as he had never called the first Catherine short. Probably because Heathcliff had a habit of doing so. The little one was always Cathy. It formed to him a distinction from the mother, and yet a connection with her, and his attachment sprang from its relation to her, far more than from its being his own. I used to draw a comparison between him and Earnshaw, and perplexed myself to explain satisfactorily why their conduct was so opposite in similar circumstances. They had both been fond husbands, and were both attached to their children, and I could not see how they shouldn't both have taken the same road, for good or evil. But I thought in my mind, Hindley, with apparently the stronger head, has shown himself sadly the worst and the weaker man. When his ship struck, the captain abandoned his post, and the crew, instead of trying to save her, rushed into riot and confusion, leaving no hope for their luckless vessel. Linton, on the contrary, displayed the true courage of a loyal and faithful soul. He trusted God, and God comforted him. One hoped, and the other despaired. They chose their own lots, and were righteously doomed to endure them. But you'll not want to hear my moralizing, Mr. Lockwood. You'll judge as well as I can all these things, at least you'll think you will, and that's the same. The end of Earnshaw was what might have been expected. It followed fast on his sisters. There were scarcely 6 months between them. We at the Grange never got a very succinct account of his state preceding it. All that I did learn was on occasion of going to aid in the preparations for the funeral. Mr. Kennet came to announce the event to my master. "Well, Nelly," said he, riding into the yard one morning, too early not to alarm me with an instant presentiment of bad news, "it's yours and my turn to go into mourning at present. Who's given us the slip now, do you think?" "Who?" I asked in a flurry. "Why, guess," he returned, dismounting and singling his bridle on a hook by the door. "And nip up the corner of your apron. I'm certain you'll need it." "Not Mr. Heathcliff, surely?" I exclaimed. "What? Would you have tears for him?" said the doctor. "No. Heathcliff's a tough young fellow. He looks blooming today. I've just seen him. He's rapidly regaining flesh since he lost his better half." "Who is it then, Mr. Kennet?" I repeated impatiently. "Hindle, Earnshaw. Your old friend Hindle," he replied. "And my wicked gossip, though he's been too wild for me this long while. There, I said we should draw water. But cheer up. He died true to his character, drunk as a lord. Poor lad, I'm sorry, too. One can't help missing an old companion, though he had the worst tricks with him that ever man, and has done me many a rascally turn. He's barely 27, it seems. That's your own age. Who would have thought you were born in 1 year?" I confess this blow was greater to me than the shock of Mrs. Linton's death. Ancient associations lingered round my heart. I sat down in the porch and wept as for a blood relation, desiring Mr. Kennet to get another servant to introduce him to the master. I could not hinder myself from pondering on the question. Had he had fair play? Whatever I did, that idea would bother me. It was so tiresomely pretentious that I resolved on requesting leave to go to Wuthering Heights and assist in the last duties to the dead. Mr. Linton was extremely reluctant to consent, but I pleaded eloquently for the friendless condition in which he lay, and I said my old master and foster brother had a claim on my services as strong as his own. Besides, I reminded him that the child, Harrington, was his wife's nephew, and in the absence of near kin, he ought to act as his guardian, and he ought to and must inquire how the property was left, and look over the concerns of his brother-in-law. He was unfit for attending to such matters then, but he bid me speak to his lawyer, and at length permitted me to go. His lawyer had been Earnshaw's also. I called at the village and asked him to accompany me. He shook his head and advised that Heathcliff should be let alone, affirming if the truth were known, Harrington would be found little else than a beggar. His father died in death, he said. The whole property is mortgaged, and the sole chance for the natural heir is to allow him an opportunity of creating some interest in the creditor's heart, that he may be inclined to deal leniently towards him. When I reached the Heights, I explained that I had come to see everything carried on decently, and Joseph, who appeared in sufficient distress, expressed satisfaction at my presence. Mr. Heathcliff said he did not perceive that I was wanted, but I might stay and order the arrangements for the funeral if I chose. Correctly, he remarked. That fool's body should be buried at the crossroads without ceremony of any kind. I happened to leave him 10 minutes yesterday afternoon, and in that interval he fastened the 2 doors of the house against me, and he has spent the night in drinking himself to death deliberately. We broke in this morning, for we heard him snorting like a horse, and there he was, laid over the settle. Flaying and scalping would not have weakened him. I sent for Kenneth, and he came, but not till the beast had changed into carrion. He was both dead and cold and stark, and so you allow it was useless making more stir about him. The old servant confirmed this statement, but muttered, I'd rather he'd gone guessing to the doctor. I should have taken him to the master, better not him. And he wasn't dead when I left, naught all sort. I insisted on the funeral being respectable. Mr. Heathcliff said I might have my own way there too. Only he desired me to remember that the money for the whole affair came out of his pocket. He maintained a hard, careless deportment, indicative of neither joy nor sorrow. If anything, it expressed a flinty gratification at a piece of difficult work successfully executed. I observed once, indeed, something like exultation in his aspect. It was just when the people were bearing the coffin from the house. He had the hypocrisy to represent a mourner, and previous to following with Harrington, he lifted the unfortunate child onto the table and muttered, with peculiar gusto, Now, my bonny lad, you are mine. And we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another, with the same wind to twist it. The unsuspecting thing was pleased at this speech. He played with Heathcliff's whiskers and stroked his cheek. But I divined its meaning and observed tartly, That boy must go back with me to Thrushgrove Grange, sir. There is nothing in the world less yours than he is. Does Linton say so? He demanded. Of course. He has ordered me to take him, I replied. Well, said the scoundrel, we'll not argue the subject now. But I have a fancy to try my hand at rearing a young one, so intimate to your master that I must supply the place of this with my own, if he attempt to remove it. I don't engage to let Harrington go undisputed, but I'll be pretty sure to make the other come. Remember to tell him. This hint was enough to bind our hands. I repeated its substance on my return, and Edgar Linton, little interested at the commencement, spoke no more of interfering. I'm not afraid that he could have done it to any purpose, had he been ever so willing. The guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession and proved to the attorney, who in his turn proved it to Mr. Linton, that Earnshaw had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his mania for gambling, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgagee. In that manner, Harrington, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and lives in his own house as a servant, deprived of the advantage of wages, quite unable to right himself because of his friendliness, and his ignorance that he has been wronged. The 12 years continued. Mrs. Dean, following that dismal period, were the happiest of my life. My greatest troubles in their passage rose from our little lady's trifling illnesses, which she had to experience in common with all children, rich and poor. For the rest, after the first 6 months, she grew like a larch, and could walk and talk to in her own way, before the heat blossomed a second time over Mrs. Linton's dust. She was the most winning thing that ever brought sunshine into a desolate house, a real beauty in face, with the Earnshaw's handsome dark eyes, but the Lintons fair-skinned and small features and yellow curling hair. Her spirit was high, though not rough, and qualified by a heart sensitive and lively to excess in its affections. That capacity for intense attachments reminded me of her mother. Still, she did not resemble her, for she could be soft and mild as a dove, and she had a gentle voice and pensive expression. Her anger was never furious, her love never fierce. It was deep and tender. However, it must be acknowledged she had faults to foil her gifts. A propensity to be saucy was one, and a perverse will that indulged children invariably acquire, whether they be good-tempered or cross. If a servant chanced to vex her, it was always, "I shall tell papa." And if he reproved her, even by a look, you would have thought it a heart-breaking business. I don't believe he ever did speak a harsh word to her. He took her education entirely on himself and made it an amusement. Fortunately, curiosity and a quick intellect made her an apt scholar. She learned rapidly and eagerly and did honour to his teaching. Join me for the next video of Wuthering Heights. Join me for the next video of Wuthering Heights with me, Morel Benard. Join me for the next video. I'll see you then. Take care. Bye.